comfortable with Teams than I am with Zoom. So if there is any technical issues, please do somebody just kind of shout out as I go through. And thank you so much for inviting me along to your event this evening. As mentioned, my name is Vicky Morris, and I'm the Risk and Resilience Manager with Aberdeenshire Council. And tonight I'm just going to talk a little bit about emergency planning and resilience from a local authority perspective. So I'm sure everyone will be aware of this, but I always like to kind of highlight at the beginning of these things that Scotland has 32 local authorities, which means there are 32 autonomous individual organisations, each with its own ways of working. So obviously with my background, I'm going to be drawing on Aberdeenshire Council's approach, which will be specific to us, but the principles of emergency planning and resilience are very much transferable. We all share the same statutory responsibilities and the same overarching obligations. We might just execute these obligations in different ways. I also wanted to allow for a sort of a mixed knowledge base within the room. I didn't want to assume any knowledge, but I also didn't want to get too bogged down in the details. So I'm going to keep my talk fairly high level, but then I'm obviously happy to pick up any kind of specific areas of interest through the discussion afterwards. And just a final note before I kind of launch into it, just to say that I've obviously got a few slides which I'm sharing. They're mainly here as a prompt for myself, but they are filled with photographs, and these are all from various emergencies that Aberdeenshire Council has had some involvement with over the last few years, so just to get a feel of the types of things that we've been dealing with. Okay, so what is resilience? This is my starting point, and I want to pose this question, and I'm not expecting an answer at this stage, but it's more of an acknowledgement that when we talk about resilience, that means different things in different contexts to different audiences. So traditionally, emergency planning within public bodies has operated in what we say the consequence management space. So this is responding to an incident once they occur and then supporting communities through recovery. We talk about resilience as the ability to respond to and recover from an emergency. We don't tend to focus on the underlying causes of an emergency once it's occurred. However, the challenge with this definition of resilience and what is now facing the emergency planning remit is that it starts from an assumption that emergencies have a clear beginning point and an end point, and that there is a stable status quo to return to. And I think it's fair to say that increasingly with climate change, it's challenging that basic assumption, which then creates the challenge of how do we adapt our processes to address this. I particularly like this quote that many of you will be familiar with, I think attributed to the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And it's precisely this point that there's a growing recognition that emergencies are no longer isolated incidents. Now, there's clearly a much sort of wider remit for local authorities within this, and it stretches into spaces which are way beyond my area of expertise. We need sort of planning around the table, there's service redesigns, there's coastal adaptation. But if I can bring it back to the emergency planning world, which is where my background's from, I do think there is a pivotal role that we can be playing in helping to strengthen our communities to withstand these long-term changes in our environment. So this evening, what I'm hoping to give is an oversight in both that kind of traditional emergency planning function, but also a nod to those kind of future conversations about the changing nature of emergencies. So getting into kind of the nitty gritty of it, a lot of you will be very familiar with this in the room, but again, I think it's always just worth kind of bringing it back to basics. Civil Contingencies Act 2004, most of the resilience work in local authorities is derived from this act, and this creates the UK's framework for emergency preparedness. The act was born out of a number of civil emergencies sort of in the late 1990s and early 2000s. There was foot and mouth, there was fuel shortages, and it was sort of discovered through those national emergencies that are the existing civil defence arrangements fell short. On top of all this, you obviously had 9/11, where our fundamental understanding of war and threats changed, and certainly in that kind of collective public conscious. So that's where the Civil Contingencies Act came from. There's two main parts to the Act, one which defines the roles and responsibilities for those involved in responding to emergencies, and the second part which gives the government emergency powers to make temporary, wide-ranging regulations for major crises. The Act also defines what we mean by an emergency. So it is an event or situation which threatens serious damage to human welfare in the place of the UK, or the environment of the place of the UK, or war or terrorism which threatens serious damage to the security of the UK. Now, there is a whole separate talk that we can be given interrogating this particular definition of what an emergency is. But I think for this evening, what I think it's fair to say is that the Act has sort of recently faced a lot of criticism, potentially for being designed for being really effective, but for short-term intensive events. So focusing on much more of a firefighting model. It struggles when it comes with long-term complex emergencies. For example, during COVID, this wasn't the Act that was used. It was utilised, it was the Public Health Act, which is where the emergency powers came from, which was felt better supported kind of that protracted nature of that kind of emergency. Moving on, so the Act also defines who are the responders. So who does the Act apply to? And we talk about it in sort of two broad terms. So we have what we call Category 1 responders. These are your traditional blue lights, so your emergency services, police, fire, ambulance service. Also includes local authorities. It includes the NHS. And you've also got SEPA, and you have most recently the health and social care partnerships have been recognised as Category 1 responders themselves. And what the Act does is it places a high degree of responsibilities and burdens on these Category 1 responders in response to an emergency. And there's sort of obligations that these Category 1 responders are expected to adhere to. You also have Category 2 responders, typically sort of utility companies, transport operators, the Met Office. They have a lesser extent of duties, but they are expected to be involved in incidents that heavily impact either their area of business, their area of work, and also they are expected to cooperate with the Category 1 responders during an emergency. You finally have this third group who are not defined within the legislation, but also have a considerable part to play within the emergency response roles, what I've called as others. So got the symbol for the Red Cross, but that's the volunteer sector, the third sector. Government isn't defined within the Act itself, but it's sort of done deliberately and to allow that degree of separation that they can provide that overarching coordinating function if required. And you've also then got the armed forces as well. And obviously they can never be factored into the Act because their support is never guaranteed. Obviously, it depends on what their overseas commitments might be. Now, just because we've been speaking a little bit this morning about some of the weather, and I can't resist the opportunity to do a little bit of myth busting around the function of the military and sort of military aid in terms of that civil response. The military have a really clear function, and they're a really useful tool, and they are very much an active part of our resilience structures in the sense that they're always around these responses and they're able to support. I think that we sort of treat them as aid, that they're able to sort of wheel them out of a cupboard at any given moment to come and support, and that's unfortunately not how it works. There needs to be a really high threshold that we would be inviting the military in to come and alleviate from their normal duties to come and support in a response. So there's a really high threshold, and it also is not a free resource. It is at cost. So every time that they get brought in, there is a public fee towards that. So I think it's just, like I said, I like to take the moment just to highlight that. Talking about, as I mentioned, those are the duties that are placed on those Category 1 responders. So very simply, there's a duty to assess risks, so understand what the risks within your sort of your area of influence or your organization's expertise. We've all got a duty to maintain emergency plans, so each organization within that will have a suite of emergency response plans. We've got a duty to maintain business continuity plans, so that is how do you maintain those critical functions that your business or your organization is responsible for despite the ongoing emergency challenges. There's a duty to promote business continuity. So this is a unique responsibility for local authorities. So this is about how we encourage businesses within our communities to be resilient. And I'll speak about that a little bit more in a moment. We've also got a duty to communicate with the public. So when we're assessing risk, we also then need to explain that to the public about what that risk is, what our emergency plans are, and how we're going to respond. We've got a duty to share information and a duty to cooperate. So that's with each other as Category 1 and 2 responders. So basically, if something happens, we will have a duty to play nice with each other and to provide each other with the information and the data that we need to allow us to respond to a particular emergency. that's sort of the who and what. This is kind of the how. So we have these resilience structures as defined within the Act. So this is how we coordinate our activity through these what we call resilience partnerships. Now, there are 3 regional resilience partnerships in Scotland, the North, which we are a part of, and then you've got the East and the West. And it's this regional resilience partnership which is the official coordinating structure as defined in the legislation. However, most of our peacetime planning and response is actually coordinated at a local level, which we call a local resilience partnership. And Aberdeenshire counts as one of 3 local authorities that form part of the Grampian, what we call the LRP, the Local Resilience Partnership. And that's where we do most of our responding and our coordinating from. So the Local Resilience Partnership, it's made up of Category 1 and 2 responders. And it's also got representatives from the volunteer sector, a military liaison officer, and there's usually a representative from the Scottish Government from the Civil Contingencies Division as well that sits within that. So this partnership is how we fulfill those 7 duties. We come together jointly to understand and assess risk. We plan for emergencies and we train and exercise as well as in that response setup as well. When a partnership is activated in response, it's typically chaired by the police. They have that kind of coordinating function and that skill set. However, it is a partnership in its true sense in that no one organisation has a power to direct another and all actions are agreed by consensus. When it comes to recovery, that's where the local authority has a much bigger remit. So, there we go. So we talk about care for people. So whilst the partnership, like I said, whilst the LRP is a partnership, obviously each agency is going to bring its own area of expertise and its strengths to the table. And the local authority have a really big remit in care for people arrangements. And these often focus on the provision of what we call support centres. So the one that typically most people are most familiar with is something called a rest centre. And this is established if people have been displaced by an emergency, if they've been evacuated from their home or displaced and they need a place of refuge to wait out the emergency before they can either return home or find alternative arrangements, alternative accommodation. So, for example, during a flooding event, and we evacuate people from their homes, we set up a rest centre to allow them somewhere safe to go to. Typically what happens is that most people, sort of return, they go there to wait out that emergency, particularly if you're in the middle of a flooding event. Nobody's wanting to be challenging travelling particularly far. And once that emergency has either sort of finished and they can return home, or like I said, they'll be moving on to alternative accommodations elsewhere. That's not the only sort of support centre that we provide. And as the nature of emergencies have changed, we've had to sort of think differently about the type of support that people are looking for. So one of the other things that we'll also activate is what we call a welfare site. And this was particularly utilised during power outages. If that we have a site and we use our sports centres because they tend to be open longer hours and we can get them well staffed. But we use them as sites for people that they can go and have hot showers, they can go charge their phones, that they can go fill a flask. And it was things like that was born out of Arwen that we found actually that was really useful. And what most people wanted actually was just to be connected, just to find out what was going on. So to be able to go somewhere that they knew that they could get power, like I said, that they could charge their phone and access Wi-Fi was actually really what lots of people were really looking for. We also work really closely with the Health and Social Care Partnership, which is what I mentioned a moment ago, and they are heavily involved in that support for the really vulnerable people within our communities. So those people that have any sort of any of their clients, so anybody with health or social care packages within the partnership. We work very closely with them to make sure that they get the support that they needed, particularly in sort of weather events. Their access to service can be incredibly limited and their resilience is significantly lower. As I mentioned, local authority also take a really lead role in recovery. And we have to consider both the long-term sort of physical infrastructure recovery, but also that psychological support for people impacted. It can be an incredibly long journey if a community has faced any sort of emergency, and weather events are our typical ones in the Northeast. If you think about a few years ago, there was Storm Frank and the impact that had on Ballater and the sort of the services that community lost and the impact that had on the residents is really, it carries on for significantly longer than I think people think. You deal with the infrastructure recovery fairly reasonably quickly, but that long-term impact on people's well-being is fairly significant. And the local authority has a huge remit within that. We have our own internal structures for managing the emergency, which is supported by our emergency response plans. This is a public document. All local authorities will have something very similar. It's just about that command and control structure. What I say is, talking about care for people, we have an obligation to care for people. How we choose to discharge that obligation, it depends on the nature of the emergency. And the most recent event with the snow was really interesting, in the sense that we took a decision at a council level that actually the best thing that we could do with the resources that we had was to try and focus our efforts on clearing the roads. Now, you may have thoughts about how successful that was, but that was what we chose to direct all of our resources into, because by connecting communities back up and allowing people to access sort of their services themselves, so whether it was shops, whether it was healthcare, whatever the normal kind of patterns of life was, that was what allowed people to be the most resilient. So that was how we sort of discharged those care for people duties and focusing where the resource was most impactful. Just moving that slide on. So that kind of broadly covers what I would call our traditional response role. And that traditional response model, like I said, is very driven by dealing with the consequences of something rather than considering the causes. What I want to turn now to is a key area of work that we're increasingly focused on, and that's the community resilience world. And by this, I mean resilience activities that happen outside of those formal structures within our communities. Now, this shift in our focus isn't solely driven by sort of climate adaptation, but there is a reality that the frequency, severity, and duration of weather events that we're experiencing is blurring those lines between response, recovery, and business as usual. So instead of these discrete one-off emergencies, we are facing rolling, compounding pressures that are fundamentally reshaping what I was saying our baseline is. What are we trying to recover to? I mean, anecdotally, those kind of once in a generation events are now perceived as occurring every few years. And I said, my world of emergency planning can't tackle this in isolation, and we play a very small part in a much bigger picture. But acknowledging that we do have a role to play in this shift in landscape between sort of emergency response and what I say that new normal. Amy Bloomin within my team, she's very much leading on this piece of work. Unfortunately, she can't be with us this evening. And just to plug that she's actually down in at St James's. She's receiving an award for her frontline service, particularly for this very field of work. So I will try and do her justice in terms of how I summarize it. But at its core, it's about how we as a local authority can support resilience from the ground up. So helping individuals and communities to identify what their own resilience goals are, and then developing long-term sustainable resilience projects. So ultimately, our aim is to reduce the number of people who are impacted by any emergencies, so that as category 1 responders, we can focus our limited resources on those who are most at risk. I think our lived experience through these emergencies has really helped shape our thinking about response. I mentioned Storm Arwen. After Storm Arwen, we saw what we sort of can only describe as an arms race for generators. That was the thing that everybody thought that they needed to have, whether it was at an individual level or a community hall level. And it was because it was for the first time for many people that they had ever experienced life without power for such a sustained period of time. I certainly haven't, in terms of in my working career, that was certainly the longest we've ever had such a high number of people coping without power and dealing with those impacts. And I suspect after the sort of the weather events earlier this year and the snow, it's going to be sort of snow blowers or freezers to stockpile milk and bread is going to be the next kind of gadget to have. But community-led resilience is not always about buying equipment or finding the funding to help people do that. And we're really careful about supporting equipment-heavy approaches. So those, whilst really useful, things like generators, it requires ongoing maintenance, it requires training, it requires storage, and it requires the people to operate that. And when you're working with volunteers, all of that is really difficult to coordinate long term. We say stuff isn't always the answer. What we try to focus on is finding the right solutions that generally match the capability, capacity, and aspirations of each community. And you mentioned earlier Fubar News. We've all seen through Fubar News just how powerful a really effective warning and informing network can be. It helps people understand what the risks are locally and helps to enable people to make sort of sensible decisions. I mean, how many of you will, before you travel during any sort of disruptive weather event, check your local community Facebook page? I mean, it's certainly what I do before heading into Aberdeen. Somebody's always put up that, the roads are clear, or watch for this particular area of flooding. And it's going to be a really useful tool, like I said, to help people make their own risk assessments. And it's not just established community groups that we're linking in with. They're obviously the easier audience to begin with because they are by their very nature already engaged in the topic and they're very willing. But we also understand that everybody's got a role to play in building our collective resilience. So linking back to what I was talking about that duty to promote business continuity, we're also working very closely with local businesses in developing their own resilience. So it's important that businesses consider their own preparations, certainly small sort of local businesses which perhaps aren't part of a wider chain or don't have that wider support infrastructure around them. And because there's a huge correlation between if a community is impacted by an event and they lose a business, how long it takes for them to recover. So it's not just that economic damage, but actually there's individual well-beings too, because it disrupts the patterns of people's lives and it takes a lot longer for people to move forward from that event. So I'm really keen on developing those community business resilience plans. It's also, there's a real potential for businesses to support people in need within their communities in a really sort of generally mutually beneficial way. We talk about one of my colleagues, she lives up in in Braemar, and during one of the power outages, the local shop, now it was able to do this because it was a small local shop and you knew the clientele, although it didn't have any power, sent in one person at a time with a torch, go find what you need, write a list of what you took, and you'll pay me back in the next couple of days. It meant that the shop could still operate. It's still, the stock didn't go to waste. It was still able to generate some income, but also was a huge lifeline to people within that community to still be able to get the basic supplies that they needed. Like I said, it's a win-win type situation. At an individual level, we're also exploring what the barriers are facing people in building their own personal resilience. So again, these barriers can be depending on sort of the different, your different sort of situations. It can be a financial barrier. It can just be a sort of a knowledge barrier. It can be just a disinterested barrier. And I think certainly for that last one, when you go through these events, when you've had that lived experience, I think that kind of helps sharpen people's thinkings around these things. And I know that the next time that we have a major storm event, there's going to be significantly more people across the Northeast that have bread and milk in their freezer, because we just have to go through that lived experience before we really appreciate something. We're also working with the Poverty Alliance and to understand some of those sort of financial barriers to resilience. And then our community learning and development team to understand challenges with adult learners. And we're also looking at how we can embed emergency preparedness into the educational curriculum so that the next generation is equipped with the practical skills and the confidence they need for the future. So just as a kind of summary for me, I appreciate that was a fairly kind of whistle-stop tour of how local authorities operate and how we're set up. And like I said, I'm more than happy to go into any particular issues or any particular areas of interest as we go through the discussion. But I think the big takeaway for me is that the resilience from a local authority perspective isn't just about the plans or the procedures or about just responding when something goes wrong. It's also about the people and the partnerships, and it's our role in how we help our communities feel more confident and more capable before anything happens. Effective resilience depends on everybody understanding their roles and working together through those command and control structures. And the partnership working that's embedded in the Civil Contingencies Act, that provides us the framework to allow us to achieve that. But like I said, we're moving away from that traditional thinking and that aim of trying to idolize a normal state to return to. Our focus now is preparing for a landscape where change is continuous, and we're adapting early alongside our communities and our partners. That's going to put us in the strongest position to respond and give us the best outcomes for everybody. And yeah, so that's my contact details. Like I said, I will happily stick around for the questions, but if anybody has any specific sort of queries that you want to get in touch with me about, I am more than happy to sort of take an email or a call or a discussion with anybody. So that's our generic team email, and that's my one as well. So thank you very much.